3 million viewers tuning in, Joe Rogan and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett clash over the explosive topic of vaccine mandates, health misinformation, and the limits of personal freedom. Rogan defends the right to question the system, citing government flip-flops and public distrust, until Jasmine calmly reveals a secret recording exposing one of his guests taking $50,000 per appearance to push anti-vaccine rhetoric. The audience gasps. The studio freezes. When a podcast becomes more powerful than science, who answers for the lives lost to well-paid lies? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the scorching Texas sun, the lights inside the Joe Rogan Experience studio buzz to life with the cold efficiency of a battlefield being prepped. After weeks of mounting controversy online, where debates over vaccine mandates, personal freedom, and political responsibility boiled over, Joe Rogan had officially invited Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett onto his show. The announcement alone sent shockwaves across social media. Comment sections turned into war zones, with some calling her a tyrant in heels, others hailing her as the last voice of reason. She accepted, not to argue, not to grandstand, but to confront the storm head-on. Jasmine knew the ground she was walking on wasn't neutral. It was mined with doubt, denial, and millions of eyeballs waiting for her to slip. As she stepped into the studio in Austin, the tension was palpable. The chairs looked soft, but the room felt like a courtroom without rules. Over 3.2 million viewers were tuned in live, watching, judging, calculating. This was more than a podcast. It was a televised battleground for the soul of a fractured nation. The opening moments were deceptively calm, like the surface of water before a crocodile strikes. Joe Rogan, in his signature black tee and steely-eyed posture, welcomed Jasmine with a handshake, half curious, half combative. The banter was civil, for a minute. Jasmine sat poised, not smiling but not hostile. She had come with one purpose, to speak truth into a space where truth had become elastic. Then, without warning, Rogan leaned into the mic and dropped the opening salvo with a voice heavy in conviction. Americans have the right not to take a vaccine if they don't trust the government. That's what freedom means. The sentence sliced through the air like a loaded bullet. The chat feed exploded. Millions watching knew the real debate had begun. Jasmine held her gaze. She didn't blink. She knew this wasn't just about science or law. It was about who lives and who dies when powerful voices dress fear in the robes of freedom. And she was ready to respond, not just for herself, but for the silent graves left in the wake of misinformation. And then, just as Jasmine inhaled to steady herself, Joe Rogan struck. He leaned into the microphone with the gravity of a man about to deliver a verdict, not a question. His fingers moved with intent, tapping his tablet, pulling up files as though laying out evidence before a jury of millions. The studio screens lit with charts, bar graphs, and clinical tables pulled from VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. He spoke in a tone that was neither emotional nor erratic, but chillingly confident, the cadence of a man who'd rehearsed this argument 100 times in his head. My team pulled these numbers this morning, he began, scrolling as he spoke. 17-year-old male, myocarditis, healthy, collapsed in his driveway 3 days after his second shot. He tapped again. 32-year-old female, no history of heart issues, dead 48 hours post-booster. Tap, tap, tap. Each new case dropped like a gavel. Each name, though anonymous, landed with the weight of a tombstone. The camera cut to Jasmine. Her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed a storm beneath. She wasn't shocked by the data. She'd seen the numbers before, studied them. But what chilled her was how Joe wrapped it all in a story, a narrative that weaponized tragedy without context. You see, he continued, adjusting his mic as if addressing the conscience of the nation, we're told to follow the science, but when someone dies after a vaccine, the narrative machine kicks in. Coincidence? Rare. Underlying condition? Always something else to blame. But if someone dies from COVID, suddenly it's their fault. They weren't responsible. They didn't care about others. They should have gotten the jab. He paused, deliberate, surgical. How's that science? That's not logic, that's doctrine. The room fell silent except for the whir of the hard drives and the muted breath of millions watching live. Jasmine's spine stiffened, the air thick around her. Rogan wasn't shouting, wasn't insulting. He was doing something far more dangerous. He was appearing reasonable. He turned personal loss into statistical leverage and legitimate uncertainty into a wedge between trust and truth. And yet in that moment, Jasmine wasn't just a congresswoman or a guest. She was the line between grief and disinformation, between a world that learns from tragedy and one that exploits it. The silence clung to the room like smoke, thick, tense, and charged with anticipation. Joe Rogan exhaled slowly, not from exhaustion, but from precision. He knew the next pivot wasn't just rhetorical, it was existential. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He spoke like a man peeling back a curtain he believed had shielded a nation from truth. "Let's get something straight," he said, his voice sharpening into a blade. "I'm not anti-science. I'm not anti-vaccine. But I am anti-bullshit." He reached across the desk and tapped his tablet, pulling up headlines, articles, corporate reports, all of them laced with glowing praise for pharmaceutical companies. Pfizer, Modern, Johnson & Johnson. Their logos spun silently on the monitor behind him, like brands on casino reels. "These companies spend more on advertising than they do on research," he said, eyes locking on Jasmine. "NBC, CNN, Fox, they all take their money. So when something goes wrong, when data doesn't look good, do you really think the coverage stays neutral?" He raised an eyebrow, letting the implications settle like ash on a fresh grave. He didn't wait for her answer. "This isn't conspiracy. It's accounting. You can trace the money, follow the ads, follow the donors, follow the pressure." His voice tightened, fists gently clenching atop the desk. "I ask questions about that, basic questions, and suddenly I'm a danger to democracy? A science denier? Hell, I'm not selling anything. I'm not the one with $1 trillion product to protect. I don't get campaign checks from Pfizer. I'm just sitting in this chair asking what your government refuses to." The words landed with brutal clarity. He wasn't making a scientific argument. He was building a moral indictment, one aimed not just at institutions, but at the woman sitting across from him. Jasmine could feel it. The narrative wasn't just challenging her facts, it was poisoning the soil she stood on. He'd positioned himself as the rebel outsider, and her as the polished gatekeeper of a system many already distrusted. It wasn't science versus skepticism, it was trust versus betrayal, and Rogan had just redrawn the battle lines. But for all the charts and headlines, the sound bites and accusations, Jasmine didn't blink. She absorbed every word like shrapnel to the chest, and still didn't flinch. The air in the studio had turned heavy, as if it too understood what was coming. Rogan had unleashed a barrage of numbers, media critiques, and suspicions soaked in confidence. But Jasmine had something more than data. She had a name. She leaned slightly forward, her spine straight but her voice dipped low. Intimate, unwavering, filled with a gravity that no algorithm could compute. "You talk about accountability, Joe," she began, her gaze fixed not at him, but through the camera, into the eyes of the millions watching. "So let me make this real. Let me give you one name." Her name was Ruby. She let the silence follow that name like a eulogy. Ruby wasn't a statistic. She wasn't a data point in VAERS or a face in a political ad. She was my mother, not by birth, but in every way that counts. She raised me when I had no voice. She fought for me when I had no future. And she believed in people even when the world gave her every reason not to. Jasmine's hands rested flat on the desk, her fingers calm, but firm, like a judge ready to deliver a ruling of her own. She lived in a small town in East Texas. One gas station, 2 churches, no hospital, a town where cell signals dropped, but radio signals didn't, a place where information didn't flow freely, it was funneled. And one day a voice slipped through that funnel. Her tone shifted, softer now but heavier. She was diagnosed with early-stage cancer, caught it fast. Her prognosis was good. We thought we had time. We had a plan. Chemo was scheduled. The doctors were hopeful. I was hopeful. But Ruby had started listening to a podcast, a popular one. It said vaccines were a form of population control, that the government wanted to track us, that Black and brown communities were the real test subjects in some global pharmaceutical experiment. It sounded educated, calm, confident. It quoted studies but never cited them. It said what she already feared, and so Ruby refused the vaccine. Jasmine's jaw clenched, but her voice never wavered. I tried to talk to her. I sent her studies, talked to her doctors, begged her to take the shot just to be safe. But that podcast had already done its work. It had drilled deep into her trust. And so, she told me she didn't want to risk being a guinea pig. She said she didn't want to end her life in a hospital bed, surrounded by people in masks, whispering through glass. Jasmine took a breath, one that held the weight of every unspoken goodbye. So she stayed home. She canceled her chemo. She wore a cross around her neck and kept a printed Bible verse on her nightstand. And she waited for God to shield her. The air around her pulsed with the unbearable quiet of held breath. Then came the neighbor's son, a sweet kid, 15 years old, home from school, didn't know he was sick. He dropped off groceries like he always did. 2 days later, Ruby started coughing. Day 3, she couldn't taste her food. By day 5, she was running a fever of 103. I begged her to let me bring her to a hospital. She said no. It's just a cold, she told me. Don't let them scare you. On day 7, she couldn't get out of bed. Her oxygen dropped to 83. I called the ambulance. She refused to get in. She said, I'll be fine. I just need to rest. Day 8, she stopped answering her phone. Jasmine closed her eyes for a second, not to cry, but to steady the storm. By the time they got to her on day 9, she was gone, alone, in a room without air conditioning, on a mattress soaked in sweat, with a half-drunk glass of herbal tea next to her, and a phone still playing that same podcast on loop. The silence after that hit like a vacuum. Not one word from the control room, not one keyboard tap from the production team. Just Jasmine, just her story, and the ghost of a woman who should still be alive. Ruby didn't die from COVID, Jasmine said, eyes locked forward, sharp as steel. She died from fear. Fear crafted with surgical precision. Fear disguised as wisdom. She died from a voice that never had to see the consequences of its words. Her breath slowed. Her hands remained still. You say you're not anti-science, Joe. You say you're just asking questions. But Ruby didn't hear them as questions. She heard them as warnings, as truth, because they came from a voice that sounded sure. And when people are scared, they don't fact-check confidence. They follow it. Her voice darkened. You didn't pull the trigger, but you helped load the gun, and Ruby wasn't the only one who took the bullet. The room remained silent, not because there was nothing left to say, but because anything else would have felt like a lie. Jasmine had turned her grief into testimony, her loss into indictment. She wasn't debating anymore. She was declaring war on the comfort of plausible deniability. And everyone in that studio, Joe Rogan included, knew it. The silence that followed Jasmine's story wasn't peaceful. It was fragile, like the moment before glass shatters under pressure. But Joe Rogan knew silence could be a trap, and he wasn't going to sit in it for long. He adjusted his mic, leaned forward slightly, and spoke with a calm that was almost surgical. Listen, he said, voice level and steady. I'm not saying Ruby's death isn't real or painful. It is. But we can't ignore what the government did during all this. At the beginning of the pandemic, Doctor, Fauci got on TV and said masks weren't needed, that they wouldn't help. Then 2 months later, he said masks were necessary. Then it became 2 masks, then maybe even 3. How are people supposed to trust that? He tapped his tablet again and pulled up a split screen of 2 clips. One from February 2020, one from April. Same man, 2 completely different messages. The screen glowed in the studio like a cold reminder of confusion. You want to talk about mixed messages? Joe went on, calm but direct. People aren't dumb, they're worn out. They watch leaders change their minds over and over. Watch the experts change the rules. Watched health officials treat the facts like a PR campaign. So yeah, when someone starts asking questions, when they say, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense, they're not being dangerous. They're being human. He looked right at Jasmine. You can't expect people to trust everything after stuff like that. That's not how trust works. Jasmine didn't reply right away. Her silence wasn't hesitation. It was control. When she did speak, her voice was clear, steady, and full of meaning. You're right about one thing, she said. People are tired. They're scared. When they see leaders change what they say, of course they worry. I do too. But here's the thing. When science changes its advice, it's not lying, it's learning. That's what science does. It adjusts when it finds new facts. It changes when there's better information. That's not weakness, that's honesty. She leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Joe. But what you're doing, it's not just asking honest questions. You're taking people's fear and pointing it at someone. You're giving them someone to blame. You're offering anger instead of answers, doubt instead of truth. You say you're not selling anything, but what you are selling is suspicion, and people are buying it because it feels easier to be angry than to deal with something that keeps changing. She pressed her hands together gently, like holding something delicate. You keep saying you're just asking questions, but here's mine for you. If you knew your microphone made people afraid of doctors, if you knew it made someone say no to help they needed, if it led to someone dying alone, would you still ask those same questions the same way? The air went still. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. The words had landed. Two voices in one room, and suddenly millions listening could hear what was really at stake. The tension in the studio had reached a brittle, volatile silence, one where even the hum of the lights seemed to retreat, afraid to interrupt. Jasmine's words still reverberated, not just in the air, but in the moral core of every viewer watching. And then, without a trace of theatricality, she moved. Not to escalate, but to expose. Her hand slipped slowly into the inside pocket of her blazer, each movement deliberate, weighted. Joe watched her, his face neutral but taut, as though instinctively aware that whatever came next wouldn't be rhetoric, it would be evidence. Jasmine pulled out a sleek silver USB drive, holding it between her fingers like a blade being unsheathed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I'd like to submit something, she said, turning slightly toward the production team. Her voice was smooth but carried a warning beneath the surface, like a calm tide just before a tidal wave. Play the video, all of it. The technician hesitated, maybe from shock, maybe from the weight of knowing what was about to unfold, then plugged the drive into the live console. The main screen behind the set went dark for a brief second. Then it lit up with a simple zoom interface. A video began to play. The image wasn't crystal clear, but it didn't need to be. What it lacked in production quality, it made up for in devastation. On the screen sat a man with salt and pepper hair, a smug smirk, and a name that millions of Rogan's followers would immediately recognize. He had been on Joe's show multiple times, marketed as an independent medical researcher who dared to challenge the establishment. In those appearances, he'd questioned vaccine safety, thrown suspicion on the CDC, and warned against what he called mass inoculation madness. But now there was no studio, no lighting crew, no polished backdrop, just a quiet Zoom call between him and what appeared to be a marketing consultant from a media firm. Jasmine's voice floated in, soft but sharp, narrating, "This is a meeting from 4 months ago. He didn't know he was being recorded. But this," she nodded toward the screen, "is who you gave your microphone to." On the video, the man leaned back in his chair and laughed, a full, unbothered laugh. "So yeah," he said casually, "I can do the spike protein angle again. You want it darker this time? Maybe lean into fertility fears a bit? I've got a couple of good lines that'll rile them up." Across the screen, the consultant responded, tone businesslike, "We're thinking $50,000 per appearance, with bonuses for anything that hits over 500,000 views in the first 48 hours. The man grinned wider. "Perfect," he said. "You want fear? I'll give you fear. mRNA sounds scary. I'll say it attacks DNA. Whatever keeps the engagement up." The camera stayed locked on him as he took a sip of coffee, then added, almost offhand, almost amused, "Let's be honest. Right or wrong doesn't really matter. If it goes viral, we win." Gasps erupted from the control room. A lighting assistant standing in the corner shifted uncomfortably. The video ended not with a fade out, but with a cold screen freeze on his smirking face. A final image more damning than any shouted accusation. The silence that followed wasn't just stillness, it was collapse. The kind of silence that swallows a room whole. Joe Rogan stared at the screen. His posture, usually loose, commanding, full of bravado, had tightened, like someone who'd just been handed a weight they couldn't ignore. He didn't speak. He didn't move. His eyes lingered on the screen, then drifted down to the desk, as if searching for words beneath the surface of the wood grain. For the first time since the conversation began, the voice that had launched 1,000 arguments was mute. And Jasmine, she didn't gloat. She didn't lean back or let her eyes say, "I told you so." She simply sat there, still, composed, her breath steady. This wasn't a victory, it was a reckoning. A quiet declaration that truth, when armed with receipts, didn't need to shout. After what felt like a full minute, Jasmine broke the silence, not to push, but to finish. Her voice was almost a whisper, yet it carried like thunder across a canyon. "You said earlier that you weren't selling anything, that you weren't pushing an agenda. But the people you gave your platform to, this is what they were selling. Fear, dressed up as rebellion. Panic, sold in packages of 30-minute interviews. They weren't telling the truth, Joe. They were closing deals." The studio remained frozen. Every eye on set was fixed on her, on the screen, on the unraveling of a false prophet exposed in his own words. Jasmine exhaled slowly. This man, this guest, he didn't just make people doubt. He made them afraid to protect themselves. And he got paid to do it. Paid to poison the conversation with lies that sounded brave, but were built on nothing. She paused, her voice growing firmer. And while he cashed his checks, people like Ruby made the ultimate payment. There was no applause, no dramatic music, just the hum of dead air and the taste of something irreversible. Because once a lie is unmasked, the room it lived in never feels quite the same. Joe remained silent. The screens behind him had gone black again, but the image still burned in every mind watching. A trusted guest admitting the truth didn't matter. Only clicks, only fear, only profit. And Jasmine Crockett, sitting in a studio that had once been a fortress of doubt, had just turned it into a courtroom. Not with volume, but with proof. Not with outrage, but with facts so clean they couldn't be scrubbed. And for the first time in the broadcast, the audience wasn't wondering who would speak next. They were wondering who, after this, still dared to. The silence that followed the video wasn't merely still, it was radioactive. It didn't fade. It hovered, pulsing like the aftermath of a detonation no one could unsee. Joe Rogan didn't reach for his mic. He didn't even shift in his chair. He didn't have to. The footage had spoken in a language louder than outrage. Proof. But Jasmine Crockett, sitting across from him, wasn't interested in watching a man squirm. She wasn't here to save her silence. She was here to complete the arc, from the personal pain of losing Ruby to the structural rot that made it possible. Her gaze swept the room once, steady and without emotion. And when she spoke again, it wasn't a response. It was a verdict. "This isn't about a single guest on your show," she began, her tone low but tightening like a snare. "This is bigger than one voice or one opinion. What you just saw, that's just one thread. I'm going to show you the web." She tapped her tablet and the monitor behind them came alive. This time, not with faces or sound bites, but with a digital map. Links, nodes, funding paths. Dozens of websites flared across the screen, each with clean medical branding and official-sounding names. Healthfront Now, MetaWare Digest, Vax Truth Research. At first glance, they could pass for CDC affiliates, but Jasmine didn't need to say it aloud. The visuals did the work. The next slide broke them apart. URL registrants traced to shell corporations, funding routed through tax-exempt nonprofits, advertising contracts with shadow media firms. "These are not blogs written by people who disagree," Jasmine said. "These are engineered ecosystems. Disinformation farms dressed up as independent inquiry. They use medical language, cite fabricated sources, and always lead with the same structure. Question the vaccine, vilify the system, and end with something to sell." The screen shifted again, this time payment ledgers, Jasmine pointed to one, highlighted in red. This site, Truth Health Watch, pulled in over $1.2 million in the last 12 months. None of it came from readers. None of it came from donations. It came from dark money political action committees and privately controlled media trusts. She didn't need to read their names. Many were already visible on screen. Groups known for sowing distrust, denying climate change, rewriting history under the banner of freedom. These organizations aren't just spreading misinformation, she continued. They're investing in it, monetizing it, weaponizing it. She turned to Joe, not as an accuser, but as someone offering the one thing more cutting than anger: clarity. You think you're giving people space to speak freely, but what you're giving, intentionally or not, is cover, legitimacy, a platform that tells viewers, if it's on Joe Rogan, it must be worth hearing. But what they're hearing isn't just opinion, it's strategy, it's monetized distrust. The screen behind her changed again, now showing social media influencer dashboards, metrics, growth spikes, hashtags, all timed within the same window. YouTubers, podcasters, TikTokers, all pushing identical narratives, sometimes within hours of each other. The vaccine changes your DNA. Hospitals are faking death counts. Natural immunity is being silenced. Look at the timestamps. Look at the coordination. That's not coincidence. That's choreography. She paused, letting the data on the screen speak for itself. Then she delivered the next cut, sharper than the last. And they were paid for it. Paid per upload. Paid per view. Paid for reach and resonance. And every time one of those videos hit 1 million views, another person like Ruby decided not to protect herself. Not because she was stupid, but because she thought she was informed. Because people in rooms like this one made sure she saw those clips first. Her voice dropped lower, but the power in it deepened. This is not free speech. This is fear for sale. A pipeline where truth isn't the goal, it's the casualty. Because fear gets shares. Fear gets ads. Fear builds loyalty. And fear, Joe, is what killed my mother. The camera panned slowly across the studio, catching the stunned faces of the crew, the motionless technicians, the audience breathing slower than they realized. Joe was still silent, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The studio had become a courtroom. The charge had shifted from bad judgment to complicity. Jasmine leaned in one final time and looked not at Joe, but directly into the lens, into the eyes of every viewer who had ever clicked, watched, shared, and wondered what was real. Dying from a virus is a tragedy, she said, her voice like a blade drawn clean. But dying because your trust was hijacked by people pretending to help you? That's not tragedy. That's a crime. No music played. No fade-out cue came. Only the reality that in a studio built for conversation, someone had just told the truth. And there was no algorithm prepared to dilute it. The final words Jasmine delivered. That's not tragedy. That's a crime. Didn't just land. They sank, like iron into water, heavy, irrefutable. For a moment, Joe Rogan didn't move. The lights hummed softly overhead. The control room behind the glass was still, and the comment feed, usually scrolling so fast it blurred, seemed to pause in collective breath. His hands were folded in front of him now, not in a defensive posture, but as if holding something invisible and fragile, the weight of culpability. Then finally his voice returned, not with its usual swagger, but in a tone flattened by something close to regret. I didn't know, he said, eyes not quite meeting Jasmine's. I didn't know about the payments, the invoices, the talking points. I never asked. The words were simple, but their edges were jagged. I brought them on because they sounded sharp, passionate, and anti-establishment. And I thought that was enough. I thought the audience could tell what was real. His voice dropped lower. I guess I was wrong to trust them that much. It was a moment no one expected. Joe Rogan conceding ground. Not just to Jasmine Crockett, but to the idea that his stage, his mic, his platform had been manipulated right under him. It was an admission, but it wasn't the end of the fight, because within seconds his gaze lifted, sharper now, not hostile, but pivoting. Reaching for familiar ground, he spoke again, louder. But let's be honest here, Jasmine. Pfizer, Moderna, these aren't clean players. They made billions. They ran PR campaigns. They pushed mandates while cutting backdoor deals with governments. They lobbied for immunity, legal immunity. That's not what innocent people do. He sat forward now, hands open, reclaiming space, not dominance, but presence. They crushed dissent. They worked with tech platforms to silence critics. They rewrote what science meant in real time. So if we're going to talk about the power of misinformation, we can't leave them out. Otherwise, this isn't a real conversation. It's just theater. It was a calculated redirection, a return to the core suspicion that had made Rogan a voice for millions who felt manipulated by institutions. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't recoil or pause. She simply inhaled once deeply and replied with a precision honed by both grief and law. "You're right," she said, voice as calm as it was carved from iron. "They're not saints. They made billions. They guarded their patents. They pushed faster than they should have. I'll never defend that. But here's the difference. Pfizer sells medicine. You can take it or not, question it or not, sue them or not." She leaned forward slightly, the gravity in her tone sharpening. "But the people on your show, the influencers on those fake medical sites, they didn't sell medicine, Joe. They sold fear. And worse, they sold it dressed as freedom." Her voice deepened, each word landing with relentless clarity. "You think corporate greed is dangerous? You're not wrong. But weaponized doubt? That's not just dangerous. That's fatal. Because a pill might have side effects, but a lie doesn't just hurt one person. It spreads, it multiplies, it infects trust, fractures families, and leaves people like Ruby dying alone because someone with a mic made them believe doctors were killers." The studio was so quiet, you could hear the soft buzz of the overhead panels. No laughter, no witty retorts, no jokes. Jasmine wasn't shouting. She didn't need to, because truth, once it finds a still room, echoes deeper than any volume could carry. She ended with a sentence so stripped of theatrics, it cut sharper than anything else that had been said. "Profit is never innocent, but killing with doubt and calling it liberty, that's not freedom, that's execution with applause." And with that, even the air seemed to retreat. The final exchange had ended not with applause, not with outrage, but with something far more rare, silence that cracked from the inside out. When the live stream faded to black, the world didn't scroll past it. It froze. For a few long minutes after the broadcast ended, there were no trending hashtags, no hot takes, no memeable clips. Just stillness. The internet, so often an ocean of noise, felt like a vacuum. But vacuums don't last. And when the reaction came, it came like a flood breaking a dam. It started with one post, then another, then another. A nurse in Michigan uploaded a thread about her father, a retired firefighter who'd refused the vaccine after watching a 2-hour interview Rogan once hosted with an unlicensed expert. He died in the ICU, terrified of being experimented on. The thread went viral in under 10 minutes. Then came a woman in Florida whose husband left their hospital mid-treatment, convinced he could cure himself with zinc and prayer. Then a teacher from New Mexico. Then a 24-year-old from Idaho, whose older brother, healthy, athletic, collapsed in his apartment after a severe COVID infection he tried to sweat out with sauna sessions and ivermectin pills. By the third hour, the platform was no longer just a reaction space. It had become a digital graveyard of memory and regret. Under the hashtag #I wish he listened, thousands of stories flooded Twitter, Reddit, Instagram, TikTok, each one a testimony not just to loss, but to misled conviction. No politicians, no bots, just raw, unfiltered grief. Screenshots of text messages, funeral photos, final voicemails. The same phrases appeared over and over. He thought the hospital would kill him. She said she didn't trust the vaccine. They told me it was all fake. Jasmine's name trended within the first hour, but she didn't post. She didn't gloat. She didn't retweet. She simply sat in her office, eyes locked on the screen, watching an invisible wall collapse. She had carried Ruby's story alone for so long. Now it was no longer a whisper in grief. It was a chorus. a reckoning. What was once dismissed as anecdotal was now undeniable. And the numbers weren't coming from epidemiologists. They were coming from children, siblings, partners, all realizing the truth not from scientific journals, but from the absence at the dinner table. And then, just as the weight of the moment reached its unbearable peak, Joe Rogan broke his silence. No podcast, no video, no apology tour, just a single tweet. Simple, quiet, almost raw in its restraint. I never thought it could go that far, but today I saw it for myself. It was posted at 7:04 p.m. Central Standard Time. Within 3 minutes, it had 80,000 likes. Within an hour, 500,000. The replies poured in fast. Some were furious, others forgiving, but none were indifferent. A few longtime fans asked if he'd been gotten to, if he was now controlled. But more than that, far more were responses from people who simply wrote, "Thank you," or "It's too late for my dad, but I'm glad you finally saw it." The tweet didn't contain an excuse. It didn't name Jasmine. It didn't name Ruby. But everyone who watched the episode, everyone who saw the clip, read the threads, felt the ground shift, knew exactly what it meant. For once, Joe didn't try to lead the conversation. He let it wash over him. The media picked it up within the hour. Headlines broke through the noise like sirens. Rogan breaks silence after podcast firestorm. Thousands share stories of loss in wake of Crockett confrontation. From Mike to Morning, the real cost of just asking questions. Cable news tried to spin it, but for the first time, they were behind. Because this wasn't a media story anymore. It was human. It belonged to the mothers who buried sons, the daughters who held phones to silent mouths, the husbands who watched lungs fail because someone convinced their wives that oxygen was tyranny. The digital sphere transformed, not in rage, but in recognition. Even longtime defenders of alternative truth podcasts began quietly walking back claims. Videos were pulled. Descriptions were updated. Disclaimers appeared like rust on old rhetoric. Some creators doubled down, but their words now landed in a world that had just watched a mask get torn off on live television. Their fear, once so weaponized, now tasted hollow. Inside the studio where it all unfolded, the air still hadn't returned to normal. The set was quiet. Lights dimmed, equipment packed up. But no one was laughing. No one was texting. The crew, many of whom had filmed Joe for years, were silent, contemplative. One sound tech sat staring at the waveform still frozen on the audio monitor from Jasmine's final words. Another whispered to a colleague, "Did you feel that? Like everything just changed?" Because it had. And Jasmine, she didn't post. She didn't need to. The truth had been spoken. The proof had been played. And now finally the world was catching up, not to her opinion, but to her reality. It wasn't justice. Ruby was still gone. Nothing would bring her back. But now for the first time, the echo chamber cracked. And through that fracture, the light got in. The clock above the studio door ticked past the final second. And for the first time in the history of the Joe Rogan Experience, there was no outro, no music, no signature quip to lighten the mood. The cameras kept rolling, but the air had shifted, no longer electrified by debate or performance, but suspended in a sacred, trembling hush. It felt like a courtroom after the verdict, or a battlefield after the last shot, when everyone's still standing, but no one's quite sure how. Joe Rogan sat motionless, elbows on the desk, hands folded loosely in front of him. His mic was still live, but he didn't lean toward it. His voice, when it came, was soft and raw, stripped of deflection, stripped of swagger. "Thank you," he murmured, eyes not fixed on Jasmine, but somewhere just past her, like he was staring into the space where assumptions used to live. This was the hardest conversation of my entire career. He didn't say it for the audience. He said it for himself, for the part of him still reeling from the realization that the platform he built for truth had been, at times, a stage for ruin. It wasn't guilt alone that flattened his tone. It was the confrontation of legacy, of having to ask whether the voices he amplified had cost lives, not just provoked thought. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't speak right away. She didn't move. She sat perfectly still, spine erect, fingers interlaced in her lap. But her breath, The rhythm of it revealed everything. The restraint, the heartbreak, the fire she'd forced into focus for over an hour straight. When she finally looked up, her eyes weren't fierce or triumphant. They were heavy with something older than outrage. Grief. "I didn't come here to spar," she said, each syllable etched with restrained pain. "I came because I've already buried one mother. I'm not willing to bury another." She paused not for effect, but because the memory of Ruby, the woman who raised her, who had been robbed not just by a virus but by the voices that twisted its truth, was threatening to surface again. Outside the camera's frame, no one moved. The producers, the tech team, even the room itself seemed to hold its breath. And for the first time, Joe Rogan didn't respond with a challenge, a counterpoint, or a casual pivot. He simply nodded once and lowered his eyes. Not in shame, but in something close to reverence. Then, without speaking further, he stood. Slowly, Jasmine stood too. There was no applause, no music, no flashing graphics to mark the end. Just two people, once adversaries in ideology, meeting in a space where truth had been wrestled into the open. Joe extended his hand, not as a show of unity, but as a gesture of acknowledgement. Jasmine took it, firmly, wordlessly. Their handshake didn't smooth over the cracks, didn't erase the damage, but it recognized that something had been exposed between them, something raw, sacred, and irreversible. For a moment, they held each other's gaze, not as opponents, not even as equals, but as two witnesses to the wreckage that unchecked influence could leave behind. And then it was over. Jasmine turned, gathered her things, and walked toward the exit. Her heels clicked softly across the floor, the only sound in a room still trembling with everything that had been said and everything that couldn't be unsaid. As she reached the door, a single camera caught her silhouette bathed in the studio's backlight, her frame small but unyielding, like a flame that refuses to dim. Joe remained standing, eyes fixed on the table between them, on the USB still lying there, on the untouched water glass, on the shadows stretching long across the wood. He didn't follow her. He didn't try to explain himself again. He just whispered, more to the silence than to anyone else. "We all think we're helping, until we realize we weren't." There was no final slogan, no viral soundbite, only the sound of one truth leaving the room, on high heels, carrying the weight of a nation that finally began to listen. The final frames of the podcast faded out, not with applause, not with music, but with silence so complete it felt engineered. It was the kind of silence that didn't invite peace. It demanded reflection. The screen went black. Then came the first image, a soft flicker, grainy, black and white, a still shot of Ruby, Jasmine's foster mother, sitting on a weathered porch swing, holding a small potted violet in her lap. Her eyes were focused just beyond the frame, like she was looking for something she couldn't quite name. The wind tugged gently at her scarf. Her smile was tired, brave. A woman who had lived through more than she ever spoke aloud. The camera slowly zoomed out, showing the full porch. Peeling paint, an old broom, a ceramic frog that had lost its nose. The background music was minimal, just a distant hum, a low and aching vibration, like a cello playing one long, mournful note. Then it began. A female voice, measured, weary, but steady, filled the space. Jasmine's voice. But not the one from the podcast, sharp and combative. This one came from a deeper place. If words can change what we believe. A rapid succession of images replaced the porch. Fake news sites, screenshots, clickbait headlines spinning across the screen like roulette wheels. Vaccine mind control program exposed. 5G towers activate COVID death genes. Don't trust the FDA, truth inside. The voice pressed on. And belief can shape what we do. Clips of average Americans flashed by. A young father explaining to his kids why they wouldn't go to school because schools push the needle. An elderly woman praying over horse dewormer tablets. A teenager in his bedroom live streaming his decision not to vaccinate, while commenters applauded. Then came Ruby's town. A map zoomed in on rural Texas, the kind of town with more cattle than doctors. A brief overhead shot of her neighborhood, sun-scorched, forgotten. The screen displayed a timestamp, July 2021, a slow dissolve transition to Ruby's name on a hospital intake screen. Ruby Ella Johnson, age 67. Symptom onset, fever, shortness of breath, cough. Days since positive test, 6. The voice sharpened. And actions can end a life? Static interrupted the visuals. Then came a voicemail. Ruby's voice, barely above a whisper. Hey, baby girl, I know I said I'd think about the vaccine, but I listened again to that doctor on the podcast. Said it messes with your immune system. I'm gonna ride this out, all right? I love you. Her voice faded as the screen turned black again, then exploded in white. A stark, brutal question appeared in block letters. Who takes responsibility when a nation chooses to live by podcasts instead of by truth? Suddenly, names began to appear, one at a time. First names, towns, causes of death. Not celebrities, just people. Lena, 52, Fort Wayne, Indiana, refused vaccine after watching Freedom Breathes YouTube channel. Died at home, alone. Tyrell, 41, Montgomery, Alabama, believed vaccine was demonic. Infected wife, daughter, all deceased. Marisol, 28, San Diego, California, shared anti-vax TikToks before being intubated. Final message, I wish I had listened. Each name flickered before fading, like candle flames snuffed by the wind. Then came Ruby's name again. Ruby Johnson, 67, Gorman, Texas, cancer treatable. COVID not. As her name lingered, images returned. Home videos. Ruby laughing at a barbecue, holding a baby, singing off-key in church, stirring a pot of beans, and then lying in a hospital bed. Eyes closed, a nasal cannula barely clinging to her face. No family beside her, just monitors and machines. Jasmine's voice returned, but now it cracked, not from weakness, but weight. This isn't about politics. This isn't about freedom. This is about the cost of confusion sold as content. On screen, side-by-side graphs appeared. One of vaccine misinformation views per month. The other, COVID deaths among the unvaccinated. The curves mirrored each other. Then the screen split again, this time between a podcast studio and a funeral home, between profit and pain, between talk and tombstones. Ruby didn't die because she made a choice, the voice said. She died because that choice was poisoned before it even reached her. Footage showed the streets outside the studio where the podcast had been filmed. Crowds gathering, candles, posters, a hand-scrawled sign, "We trusted." They cashed in. Then a new montage. Influencers laughing while reading paid ad scripts. Podcast hosts winking into the camera while saying, "They don't want you to know this." Followed by affiliate links and donation buttons. A spreadsheet floated on screen, displaying payments. $50,000 per episode. $2.1 million annual disbursement from a dark money pack. Then silence again. And finally, Jasmine's voice one last time. Bare, stripped of all armor. To everyone who lost someone because truth was drowned by noise, I'm sorry. A black screen again. Then white text appeared, glowing like a whisper carved in stone. Dedicated to Ruby and to the millions who believed and paid the price. For several long seconds, the screen remained still. Then faintly, the sound of a rocking chair creaked in the background. No image, just sound. And after that, nothing. No credits, no logos. Just one last breath of silence. So deep and cold it felt like the closing of a chapter the country didn't know it had written. The silence after the dedication to Ruby still hung in the air, like the aftershock of a slow-motion explosion. Nothing left to prove, yet everything to remember. The screen remained dark, as if even the pixels were processing the truth just revealed. And then, without warning, the story rewound, not through time, but through soul. A classroom flickered onto the screen. Old, dusty, warm sunlight cutting through half-closed blinds. The chalkboard worn thin from years of erased ideas. A younger Jasmine sat in the back row, notebook in hand, watching as a silver-haired professor paced before a row of uninterested freshmen. But Jasmine was different. Her eyes followed every word like scripture. She wasn't chasing a grade. She was hunting meaning. The voiceover returned, softer now, like the voice of conscience itself. Before she fought for policy, before she stood toe-to-toe with power, she studied the humanities. The screen now showed pages from her college textbooks, marked, underlined, circled, bleeding with marginal notes in frantic ink. What is justice if it excludes the vulnerable? Truth without empathy is tyranny, the voice continued. She chose literature over algorithms, philosophy over programming, ethics over economics. Not because it was easy, but because somewhere deep in her soul, she believed the human heart mattered. Cut to a classroom debate. A younger Jasmine stands before her peers, passionately defending the value of compassion in public leadership. Her classmates roll their eyes. One of them, a future venture capitalist, laughs. "You can't pay rent with empathy, Crockett." She doesn't flinch. She closes her folder and responds, "You can't rebuild a nation with indifference either." Then silence. And then, as if history itself was watching, the film shifted to years later. Jasmine in Congress. She's being talked over by a male colleague. Again. Her mic is cut, her time is limited, her voice is rushed, yet every time she resets, calm, resolute, carrying centuries of moral philosophy in every syllable. A voice cuts through again. People say studying the humanities is useless, but she didn't study it to be useful. She studied it to understand what we're supposed to be. The screen split into a collage. MLK quoting Thoreau, Angela Davis citing Kant, James Baldwin dismantling systemic injustice with nothing but language. And in the center, Jasmine. Jasmine reading Baldwin under a lamppost during her college work-study job. Jasmine arguing in class that Plato's Republic fails to account for Black women. Jasmine writing a paper titled "The Price of Being Human in a Dehumanized System." The score swelled, not triumphantly, but reverently. A soft choir began, wordless, like a memory hums instead of speaks. Then the tone shifted. New footage rolled. Jasmine walking into her first legal aid clinic, her humanities degree in one hand, law school rejection letters in the other. The woman at the front desk had laughed. "You majored in what?" "You should have picked finance, honey." But she stayed. She stayed when the client stories broke her. She stayed when the housing cases stacked higher than her paycheck. She stayed when judges cut her off, when politicians called her soft, when headlines ridiculed her as overly emotional. The camera zoomed into her eyes, then and now, still burning, still haunted, still brave. Back in the present day, in a dimly lit post-podcast corridor, Jasmine stands alone. Joe's studio is silent behind her. Her fists are clenched, not from anger, but from restraint. A producer walks by and says, almost dismissively, "You were impressive. Didn't know you were that sharp." She turns, slowly. Her voice is quiet, final. "I didn't learn that in law school. I learned that from reading Audre Lorde." He doesn't respond. He disappears. She walks out into the night. Cut to her apartment, modest, cluttered with books, stacks of letters, photos of Ruby, a single post-it on her bathroom mirror. The world won't change itself. She exhales, staring at her reflection, not with pride, but with exhaustion. Then she opens her laptop. Emails pour in. Thousands, stories, losses, truths denied, lives ended. She opens one. A mother in Nebraska writes, "My husband thought the vaccine was poison. He listened to hours of it. He begged me not to take it. I did anyway. I'm alive. He's not." Jasmine doesn't reply. She just closes her eyes, lips parting with the weight of unspeakable grief. The next day, congressional hearing room, same faces, same smirks. But Jasmine walks in differently, slower, heavier, not broken, but forged. She places a single book on the desk in front of her, The Ethics of Memory by Avishai Margalit. No one notices, but it matters. The chairperson interrupts her time. Again. She doesn't argue. She raises her hand. Before I speak as a congresswoman, she says, I'd like to speak as a student of the humanities. The room laughs, but only once. She opens with a quote, "The opposite of forgetting isn't remembering. It's justice." Then she lays out the names, the deaths, the disinformation. She doesn't shout. She doesn't accuse. She simply tells the truth. Because she learned long ago that truth doesn't need volume, just courage. The screen now flashes back one last time to her final day in college. Graduation robe, her name called, applause brief. No one knew her name then, but she looked into the crowd and Ruby was there, clapping through tears. Ruby mouthed something. The camera never caught it, but Jasmine remembered. Use your words, save someone. The frame froze, cut back to present. Jasmine standing at a podium, eyes closed, hands steady. The crowd below her, silent. She opens them. I wasn't trained to win arguments. I was trained to understand what happens when we stop listening to each other. And that's what almost killed us. That's what killed her. The crowd doesn't clap. They rise one by one. Not for applause, but for reckoning. And yet, what good is clarity if it dies in silence? The crowd stood, but the air between them was heavy, like history itself holding its breath. Jasmine's hands trembled slightly at her sides, not from fear, but from restraint. This was the moment every sleepless night had led to. Every funeral attended in silence. Every letter never answered. But she didn't raise her voice. She lowered it, like a conductor before the final movement. You stood for the dead, she began softly. Now stand for the living. A murmur rippled, but it wasn't noise. It was awakening. She walked down from the stage, not with swagger, but with sacred weight. Her eyes didn't scan the crowd for agreement. She looked for the ones who were unsure, the ones gripping the edge of belief, the ones who hadn't spoken, because they didn't know if it mattered. She spoke to them now. They tell us to move on, to stop blaming podcasts, to stop blaming disinformation. But moving on without accountability isn't healing. It's surrender. Behind her, the screen came alive. It was no longer charts or faces. It was mirrors. Real people holding real photos. Ruby, a father who died in Kansas, a teacher from Baltimore, a daughter who still kept the last voicemail from her mother who refused treatment because of what she saw online. If we don't hold the architects of this deception accountable, then we've learned nothing. And if we've learned nothing, they'll do it again. Different virus, different lie, same result. Jasmine raised a tablet above her head. One file opened. This is draft legislation, the Digital Transparency and Truth Act. No music played, no banners unfurled, but something seismic cracked through the silence. It demands full disclosure of financial ties for public health content. It criminalizes targeted disinformation campaigns during national emergencies. It gives the FTC the teeth it was stripped of years ago. It makes truth, for once, legally defensible. And then, her voice hardened, it doesn't ban speech. It bans manipulation. It doesn't silence dissent. It silences profit-motivated deceit disguised as dissent. The crowd murmured louder now. Some unsure, some ignited. Don't clap. Don't repost. Don't hashtag. Demand this from your lawmakers. Show up. Call them. Corner them. Tell them Ruby mattered. Tell them you remember the cost. She didn't wait for applause. She turned, began walking. But the camera followed. And the audience, suddenly, wasn't just in the room. It was in living rooms, on sidewalks, on hospital break rooms, on the back steps of churches, across the country, across all the places where grief had long since gone quiet, but never cold. This isn't about one death, she said into the next microphone, now at a press conference 3 days later. This is about how we build a culture where a lie is easier to find than a hospital. And we called that freedom. Reporters flinched. Networks edited for the 6 p.m. broadcast. But people heard it uncut online. You want a real First Amendment debate? Let's have it. But first, tell me why a 22-year-old with no medical license can broadcast to 10 million people about heart inflammation and get paid more than a surgeon saving lives in an ER. She dropped a name, then another, then an organization. Their legal team stirred. But the crowd didn't blink, because she wasn't punching. She was unveiling. This isn't about punishing skeptics. This is about exposing merchants of chaos. If your model needs ignorance to survive, it's not journalism, it's trafficking. The scene blurred again. Jasmine on a school stage this time. Auditorium packed with students too young to remember the early pandemic, but old enough to inherit its aftermath. She asked them a question. Who do you trust? Silence. Not because I want an answer, but because I want you to wonder why it's so hard to give one. Then she pulled a copy of The Plague by Camus from her bag. You want to fight tyranny? Start by fighting the temptation to believe the loudest voice. Truth doesn't scream, it survives. They didn't cheer, they stood. Again. But this time they moved. Clips went viral. A retired nurse from Nevada announced she'd come out of retirement to join a nationwide truth audit task force. A nonprofit formed within weeks called Ruby's Echo, with the sole mission of tracing funding ties in health media and flagging disinformation in real time. Former data scientists at social media platforms resigned and joined the effort. Whistleblowers came forward. A father in Indiana set up a website titled Last Words Unheard, where families could submit the final texts or voicemails of loved ones lost to vaccine denial. It crashed within 2 hours due to demand. At a White House briefing, a reporter asked the press secretary, "Will the administration support Crockett's legislation?" The answer came 3 hours later, from the president himself. The truth is under attack, and we need new armor. Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't appear on every talk show. She didn't publish a memoir. Instead, she went to Ruby's old church, sat in the back pew, listened to the organ, and prayed, not for peace, but for stamina. Because the real war hadn't ended. It had just been named. The studio lights dimmed to black, but the pulse of the conversation still echoed in the silence, like a distant thunder rolling through the hearts of everyone who watched. Jasmine didn't leave the studio immediately. She sat still, gazing not at Joe or the cameras, but at the empty space in front of her, as if she could still see Ruby sitting there. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white, her body unmoving like a monument carved from the paint of memory. What she'd said was out there now, alive in the bloodstream of a country that couldn't unhear it. And the question she had posed, who bears the weight when misinformation becomes fatal, lingered like smoke after a fire. Outside, the sky over Austin was turning from burnt orange to deep indigo. The crew spoke in hushed tones, unsure whether to break the tension or respect it. Jasmine finally stood, slowly, like someone stepping off sacred ground. She nodded once to Joe, who returned it with a look somewhere between remorse and respect. No more words were needed. Some truths once spoken created silence in their wake, not of avoidance, but of reckoning. Later that evening, the clip began circulating online. But this time, it wasn't a soundbite, wasn't a manipulated quote, wasn't a twisted headline. It was Jasmine's voice in full. Her grief, her fury, her logic, her facts. It traveled faster than expected, not because it was viral, but because it was vital. People didn't just share it. They wept over it, argued about it, texted it to relatives they hadn't spoken to in months. It reopened wounds and demanded accountability. Hashtags emerged. #, Justice for Ruby. Truth over clicks. Speak responsibly. Celebrities shared it. Doctors commented on it. Even skeptical influencers, known for peddling distrust, posted it with captions like, "We need to listen." Within 48 hours, congressional staffers began drafting a bipartisan proposal to require transparency for podcast sponsorships that discussed public health. A coalition of physicians sent an open letter to Spotify, demanding better labeling systems for medically sensitive content. Joe Rogan himself went live briefly the next day, stating, "What I saw and heard shook me. I don't know where this goes next, but I know I'm not walking away from it." And Jasmine? She returned to Washington, D.C. not to celebrate, but to build. Her team expanded their public health advocacy platform. Ruby's story became the centerpiece of a new campaign called Echoes of Misinformation, traveling from schools to town halls across the nation. Jasmine stood before parents, nurses, veterans, even those who had once doubted her. She didn't shout. She didn't condemn. She invited them to listen, to Ruby's voice, to the cost of silence, and to the real meaning of responsibility in an age of amplified noise. One night at a candlelight vigil in Houston, surrounded by a sea of quiet faces and trembling hands holding photos of loved ones lost, Jasmine spoke one sentence that landed like a bell tolling across a country on the brink of awakening. The truth may not always be convenient, but tonight, let it be enough to begin. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Inside the stone walls of the Capitol, under blinding lights and a nation watching, Jasmine Crockett confronts Mike Johnson, the mastermind of a ruthless urban rescue plan that pushes poor families out while the rich cash in. He laughs her off, mocks her as a distraction, but within minutes she unleashes a firestorm. Confidential recordings, rigged maps, and investor memos soaked in greed. The room turns ice cold. His face drains. The mask shatters. If power can wipe out entire communities with a pen and call it justice, what else are they erasing while we're not looking? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing chamber crackled with quiet tension, the kind that settles right before a political ambush. Beneath the Capitol's vaulted ceiling, the room resembled a courtroom disguised as a war zone. Polished mahogany desks arranged like opposing trenches. The gold-lettered placard read, "Oversight Hearing on Transparency and Ethics in the Urban Rescue Initiative." But everyone present knew this wasn't about oversight. It was about exposure. Jasmine Crockett sat poised at the left bench, her navy suit sharp against the sterile white walls. She was still unreadable, but the stack of documents before her, eviction notices, doctored land titles, buried contracts, radiated heat. Behind her, housing advocates and displaced citizens filled the gallery. Outside, chants echoed faintly, muffled by stone but steady. Then the door opened. Mike Johnson strode in with a polished calm, his suit gleaming faintly under the lights, every movement oozing entitlement. He made his way down the aisle like a man campaigning in a room he already owned, shaking hands, trading smirks. He never looked at Jasmine. To him, she wasn't competition, just background. At the front, he took his seat like a king returning to court. The chairman invited Representative Crockett to open the hearing. She inhaled, but Johnson cut in, his voice smooth and mocking. Excuse me," he said, leaning slightly into the microphone, his voice smooth, rehearsed, polished. "Before we begin, I just want to say, I must have misread the docket." He let the silence hang just long enough to create discomfort. Then with a half smirk, "I thought we were here to discuss development strategy, not to attend Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's lecture on urban resentment." A few aides chuckled, unsure whether to commit. The joke was calculated, not just to mock Jasmine's focus on the human cost of policy, but to box her into a stereotype. Emotional, dramatic, unserious. And he wasn't finished. "I mean, let's keep things grounded today," he continued, turning a page in his folder as if reviewing a shopping list. "This is Congress. We're here to talk about cranes and concrete, not poetry and protest signs." The room stilled. Some members shifted in their chairs. The remarks hadn't just been dismissive, they were surgical. Johnson was drawing a line. "I am reality. She is theater." But Jasmine didn't rise to the bait. Her gaze never wavered, her face an impenetrable mask. What Johnson mistook for silence was precision. She knew exactly what he was doing. She had seen men like him, men who believed their suits made them righteous, that their tone absolved their cruelty. And she knew what came next. The real hearing hadn't started yet. This was only his opening performance. And like every showman drunk on his own applause, he didn't realize the trap had already been set. The smirk was still resting on Mike Johnson's lips when Jasmine Crockett reached for her laptop. Not with haste, but with a kind of practiced calm that unnerved more than any raised voice could. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her fingers moved across the keyboard like a pianist preparing for a concerto, silent and precise. The lights dimmed slightly as the projector activated behind her, casting its glow onto the wall like an unfolding indictment. The screen came alive with color-coded overlays, district lines, zoning codes, and a legend that bled red where lives had already been uprooted. The map zoomed slowly into frame, and 7 neighborhoods lit up like open wounds. Bold black text labeled them clearly: East Elridge, South Montclair, Ward 9, Hollow Creek, Vista Gardens, Lake Harlan, Dubois Terrace. Each name landed like a courtroom exhibit, a flash of memory for someone in the audience who had lost a home, a neighbor, a street they once knew by heart. Jasmine didn't narrate, not at first. She let the room absorb what it was seeing, the concentration of red, the unnatural symmetry of injustice. Then with a keystroke, the next layer appeared. Demographics. A sidebar listed the data with chilling precision. 6 of the 7 neighborhoods had populations that were over 80% Black or Latino. Their median household incomes ranged from $14,300 to $17,800. Average eviction rates were nearly 3 times the city's norm. It wasn't just urban poverty, it was engineered vulnerability. A silence spread over the room like fog. No one shuffled papers. No aides whispered. Even the cameras hesitated, as if unsure whether to zoom in or stay wide. She didn't look at the screen. She looked at him. "Mr. Johnson," Jasmine began, her voice low but immovable, "could you explain for the record why 92% of the Urban Rescue Initiative's Phase 1 target zone overlaps with the poorest, most racially segregated neighborhoods in this state?" Her eyes didn't waver. "And why not a single square mile of that zone touches the waterfront industrial lots owned by Lexington Holdings, Hartwell Realty, or Sycamore Capital? 3 of the largest commercial landholders in the city, and incidentally, 3 of your top campaign contributors?" The question was a scalpel masked as a sentence. It didn't shout, it sliced. A slow wave of tension moved through the hearing room, the kind that turns breath into a liability. One of Johnson's aides scribbled something in the margins of a memo. A journalist looked up, startled, unsure if they had just missed the beginning of the real story. For a split second, Mike Johnson's posture faltered. He adjusted his cufflinks, an unconscious tic, and glanced briefly at the screen before forcing a relaxed lean into the microphone. "Well," he said with exaggerated courtesy, "Congresswoman Crockett, perhaps it's because those neighborhoods need rescuing the most." His voice dripped with practiced paternalism, the kind of tone used by people who believe their power gives them moral clarity. He stretched the word rescuing like a silk ribbon across barbed wire. "You of all people," he added, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "should understand the urgency of improving living conditions in communities like these." It was the kind of reply designed not to answer, but to reframe, to turn displacement into charity, to cast demolition as benevolence. But the gallery didn't buy it. Jasmine heard it in the small intake of breath from a mother sitting 3 rows back. Saw it in the way a man in a construction uniform clenched his jaw. Someone whispered shameful under their breath. Johnson continued flipping through his folder as if he were paging through dinner menus, unfazed. But the air had changed. It was thicker now, denser, and even he could feel it. What Mike Johnson failed to realize, what men like him so often miss, is that power projected without precision collapses under scrutiny. Jasmine hadn't come to prove him wrong with volume. She came with evidence, with patterns, with numbers soaked in the bloodless violence of policy. And when she spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She simply raised the floor he was standing on and let the truth do the rest. The map behind her didn't fade. It glowed, red, bold, and unmovable, just like her. The data had wounded him, but Jasmine wasn't finished. Numbers might expose intent, but only faces could reveal consequence. She paused, glanced at the committee chair, then silently cued another file. The lights dimmed once more as the screen behind her lit up, not with graphs or zoning overlays, but with the unsteady frame of a handheld phone camera. "This was recorded at 3:04 a.m. last Tuesday," she said softly. "Ward 9, Phase 1. The chamber quieted to a hush that felt unnatural. The footage began. The glow of police lights bled through the night fog, blue and red swirling over cracked pavement and shuttered porches. The audio was raw. No narration, no filters, just the frantic voice of a woman off-screen. "Please, officer, just let me stay until morning. He's 6. He's sleeping." The camera shifted, catching her in frame. A woman in a grease-stained work uniform, barefoot, one arm shielding her child, the other raised instinctively between herself and two officers standing at her front door. Their helmets gleamed under the streetlight. Behind them, a squad car idled with its doors open, engine purring like an executioner waiting to be summoned. Then came the boy. A small figure stumbled into view, dragging a tattered blanket behind him, his face twisted in the kind of terror too primal to be performed. "Mama!" he called out, his voice thin and cracked with sleep. The mother turned, dropped to her knees, wrapped both arms around him. But within seconds, one of the officers stepped forward and ordered them off the property. The camera trembled as its holder gasped audibly. In the distance, a neighbor could be heard yelling, "He didn't even get notice!" But the officers didn't turn. The screen went black as the recording ended. The chamber remained frozen. The image of that boy, barefoot, clutching his mother, now scorched into the minds of every person present. Jasmine stood still, hands folded, letting the silence speak before she did. It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. She knew the weight of stillness when truth had just been made visible. Mike Johnson's voice cut in like static. "Law enforcement acted within the bounds of a signed warrant," he said, his tone steady but thinner than before. "All removals conducted under the Urban Rescue Initiative are supported by due process. That footage, while emotional, does not reflect any violation of procedure." His words echoed off the marble like bureaucratic armor being strapped on in real time. He sounded prepared, but not unmoved, not quite. Something in the gallery had shifted. The tension now clung to him. Johnson glanced down at his notes, then back at Jasmine, his lips parting slightly, perhaps expecting her to escalate with outrage. But she didn't raise her voice. Her tone dropped lower, more precise. "You're right about one thing," she said. "That footage is emotional because what it shows isn't a violation of procedure. That's the problem." Her words fell like hammer blows, steady and spaced. "The system you signed into law allowed a mother to be dragged from her home at 3 a.m. while her son screamed in his pajamas. And because every box was checked, you think that makes it clean." She took a breath, not out of fatigue, but control. "But legal does not mean ethical. Lawful does not mean just. And procedure does not absolve policy that brutalizes the people it claims to rescue." She stepped back, her gaze never leaving his, her presence more commanding than any raised voice could be. Across the gallery, heads nodded, not in anger, but in recognition, the kind of slow, painful acknowledgement that comes when someone finally names a thing no one in power had the courage to say. And for the first time since the hearing began, Mike Johnson didn't interrupt, because Jasmine had just weaponized silence, and every second he didn't speak made it louder. The silence after Jasmine's last words was still heavy in the room, but she didn't stop. She clicked the remote again. The screen behind her changed, not to more video or maps, but to something colder: paperwork, profits. "Now," she said calmly, "let's talk about what this project was really designed to rescue." The audience leaned forward. A scanned document appeared, marked "Confidential, Internal Use Only." It was a financial report from Lexington Growth Fund, one of the biggest investment firms behind the Urban Rescue Initiative. In the center of the slide, highlighted in bold black letters, was a sentence that made the whole room tighten. "Estimated property value increase 6x to 9x within 12 to 18 months post-removal of low-yield populations." There it was. No emotion, just numbers. And behind them, people erased like they didn't matter. "Removal. Low-yield populations," Jasmine said again, clearly and slowly. "That's how they describe the families in East Elridge, in Ward 9, in Hollow Creek, people with jobs, with children, with lives." She paused, letting the room feel the weight of those words. "But to these investors, they're just in the way." Her voice was steady, calm, but every word hit harder than the last. She clicked again. A second slide appeared, this time a donation record showing names like Urban Reforge LLC, Selwyn Partners, Ridgefront Holdings. These companies are all part of Lexington, Jasmine explained. Together, they gave $2.1 million to a political group called American Future. The timing? Right after Phase 1 of this plan was approved. She tapped again. Another slide. This one showed where that money went. Most of it, nearly 3/4, was spent supporting one candidate's campaign. She turned to face him fully. That candidate, she said clearly, was you, Mr. Johnson. Now the room shifted. Even the air felt tighter. Jasmine continued without raising her voice. I'm not saying this was illegal. That's not for me to decide. But let's call it what it is. The people who said poor neighborhoods should be cleared for profit are the same people who helped fund the campaign of the man who signed off on the clearing. Johnson didn't move much, just a slight twitch in his face. But it was the first time he showed anything that resembled discomfort. His body no longer looked so confident. He was sitting smaller now, more still. Jasmine stepped forward just enough to close the space between the evidence on the wall and the man who was being asked to answer for it. This isn't about smart planning, she said. It's about responsibility. This is a program dressed up as public good, but it was built on a business model that expected people to be pushed out. That needed people to lose their homes to make the numbers work. She set her hand gently on the table. No slamming, no shouting, just finality. So my question, Mr. Johnson, isn't whether you built something. It's whether you sold it, sold people's homes, lives, and futures before they even knew what was happening. The chamber didn't make a sound, not a breath, not a cough. Even power, for once, felt quiet. Because Jasmine wasn't just revealing facts. She was revealing the truth behind the system. And she wasn't asking for mercy. She was demanding justice. The silence that followed Jasmine's dismantling of the money trail wasn't just heavy, it was radioactive. Mike Johnson sat frozen for a beat too long, the flicker of restraint in his eyes beginning to falter under the weight of the moment. Then, like a pressure valve snapping loose, he pushed forward in his seat, the microphone catching the sharp intake of breath before his voice cracked the air. You're twisting facts into fiction, he said, louder than necessary, his tone edged with the bitterness of a man no longer speaking to convince, but to contain. You're building conspiracies out of shadows. Just enough suggestion to make it sound sinister, but nothing real, nothing actionable. His hand gripped the table now, two fingers tapping in quick, uneven rhythm. I didn't sell land. I don't own the land. I don't profit from what happens after revitalization, he said, each word clipped, his rhythm accelerating. What I did, what this initiative does, is create opportunity. We rebuild what was decaying. We bring investment into places that were ignored for decades. He stopped for a moment, but only to catch breath, not clarity. His voice, when it returned, came harder, angrier, and less refined. You want to stand there and accuse me of orchestrating some corporate takeover while ignoring the truth, that these communities were falling apart long before I got involved. You want a villain? Fine. Paint me as the villain. But don't pretend you're here for justice. You're here for spectacle. There was no applause, no murmur of agreement. The gallery remained still, watching, processing, recoiling. Because what Mike Johnson failed to understand in that moment was that volume is not proof, and defensiveness is not strength. The more he spoke, the clearer it became. He wasn't answering questions. He was trying to outrun them. His voice reverberated through the chamber like a door slamming shut. Loud, jarring, but unmistakably hollow. The air in the hearing room was already stretched thin, the atmosphere brittle with tension. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. Not yet. She stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on Mike Johnson, her voice calm but unyielding. Since we're debating facts, she said almost quietly, let me offer one more. She pressed a single key. The screen faded to black. Then came sound. Not polished testimony, not legal jargon, but the unmistakable hum of a live recorded call. No soundtrack, no spin, just reality captured raw. A male voice filled the chamber, calm, professional, resigned. Senator Johnson instructed us to accelerate the removals in Ward 7, it said. His words were clear. We need those units cleared before Lexington releases funds. Make it clean, push it through legal, but don't wait. No one in the room moved. The recording played like a confession with no room for misinterpretation. It didn't suggest, it confirmed. The voice didn't sound vindictive. It sounded tired, as if the speaker had been carrying this weight for too long. Jasmine didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The silence after the recording ended was more powerful than any commentary. It was the sound of a lie collapsing in real time. Even the most hardened aides looked shaken. The gallery held its breath. The oxygen in the room seemed to vanish. Mike Johnson blinked. For the first time all morning, he looked truly exposed. Not politically, but personally. He tried to sit taller, but there was no posture left to hold. The flush in his face had drained, leaving behind something paler, thinner. He leaned forward, hands flat on the desk, and spoke without conviction. I don't manage every operational detail, he said. His voice lacked its earlier bite. It didn't even reach the back of the room. The words hung in the air, frail and unfinished, like a dropped curtain on a stage no longer under his control. But no one was asking about operational detail. What hung over him now wasn't a question of logistics. It was one of intent. The recording didn't implicate a system. It implicated him, and everyone knew it. The residue of the recording still clung to the chamber like smoke when Jasmine turned calmly toward the committee clerk. Her voice, barely above a whisper, was absolute. Call the next witness. Chairs shifted, heads turned, and from the side entrance a man stepped forward. Not a lawyer, not a polished political operative, but someone who wore the quiet fatigue of long service. He looked to be in his mid-50s, hair thinning, shoulders slightly hunched, the edges of his suit just a bit too worn. He didn't walk with urgency. He walked like someone who knew what it meant to carry something too long and had finally decided to put it down. He took the oath, sat at the witness table, and folded his hands. Jasmine's voice guided him gently into the spotlight. Please state your name and former position with the Urban Rescue Initiative. He cleared his throat and spoke without embellishment. My name is Thomas Grady. I served as a senior data analyst in the Planning and Zoning Subcommittee for Phase 1 of the Urban Rescue Initiative. He paused, steadying himself. I was on the internal task force responsible for identifying redevelopment zones. Our job was to run demographic reports, cross-reference income, property ownership, and density metrics to determine which neighborhoods would be prioritized. He looked directly at the panel now, his voice growing firmer, as if each word peeled back a layer of silence. We were instructed to develop what they called a viability matrix. That matrix included columns for median income, ethnic composition, rental concentration, and voting history. If a neighborhood had a high percentage of renters making under $20,000 a year, it was flagged. He blinked, voice tightening. The phrase we heard in our closed meetings was population filtering. Specifically, we were told to clear the central corridor. The order was explicit. Remove low-yield residents, low yield meaning low income, so that the district could be revalued and repositioned for high-end investment. There was a rustle among the audience. On the dais, several lawmakers shifted uneasily in their seats. The room had heard injustice before, but this was strategy. This was design. Grady exhaled sharply and finished. We weren't planning renewal. We were cleansing a map. That's the word that was used in one internal memo. Cleansing. Before the shock could settle, Mike Johnson, tense, visibly rattled, leaned forward and cut in, his voice louder than necessary. Perjury is a federal crime, Mr. Grady, he said. You better be damn sure of what you're putting on the record. Grady didn't even flinch, but Jasmine rose slowly, turning toward Johnson with a calm that felt like a blade sliding from its sheath. And covering the truth with silence, she said, isn't just cowardice. It's complicity. Her voice did not tremble. It rang out with the weight of something final, something irreversible. In that moment, it wasn't about who shouted louder. It was about who had dared to speak at all. And Mike Johnson, for all his power, had just threatened a man for telling the truth under oath, in a room already drowning in proof. The echo of Jasmine's last rebuke still reverberated through the chamber, when she turned back toward the projector, her steps slow, precise. The room hadn't recovered from the witness testimony, but she wasn't about to let the momentum bleed. She reached down and tapped the spacebar. The lights dimmed again, and this time, the screen filled not with documents, but with a short video. Shaky, intimate, too real to ignore. The footage opened on a small, weathered home. Red brick facade, chipped white trim, a rusted screen door that hung slightly crooked. The front yard was neat but modest. A plastic tricycle sat by the steps. A worn welcome mat lay crooked by the entrance. In the corner of the screen, a timestamp read, March 14th, 2023, 6:12 a.m. The voice behind the camera was a woman's, clear, tired, but trying to stay composed. This was my mother's house. She bought it in 1982. They came last week and said it was part of the redevelopment zone. Said we had to go. She stepped back to show a white notice paper, stapled to the front door like an eviction flag. Zooming in, the camera caught the bold header. Notice of acquisition under Slum Redevelopment Act. Section 8C. Beneath it, in dry bureaucratic ink, was the stated compensation. $11,230. They said it's fair, the woman continued, her voice cracking just slightly. They said the future value is going to be over $300,000, but we're not part of that future. The camera panned briefly to a little boy peeking out from behind the curtains. He couldn't have been more than 6. Mama, he whispered, are they taking my room? Then the screen went black. The room was motionless. Jasmine let the silence hang, not because she needed the drama, but because it was the only way to give the audience time to feel what they'd just seen. When she finally spoke, her voice was as sharp and as still as a scalpel cutting into silence. That home, she said, was professionally assessed at $320,000. That's not an estimate. That's the listed market valuation from 3 separate municipal reports filed between 2021 and 2023. And yet, under the language of the Slum Redevelopment Act, the family was awarded $11,230. Not because that's what the home was worth. She held up a printed legal document, its lines highlighted in furious yellow. But because Section 12 limits compensation to no more than 5% of the projected post-development investment value. She stepped forward, voice low but burning. Not current value, not fair market rate, not relocation cost, projected investment value. Her eyes locked on Johnson. In other words, they were paid based on what someone else might make after the bulldozers come, after the neighborhood is cleared, after the profit is realized. She paused. But none of that belongs to the family who lived there for 41 years. Not the land, not the memories, not even a fair check. A tight rustle moved through the crowd. No one whispered. It was the kind of physical reaction people had when their bodies couldn't contain the outrage. Then Jasmine read directly from the contract. In no case shall awarded compensation exceed 5% of projected reinvestment appraisal as calculated by authorized development partners. She looked up again. That phrase, authorized development partners, refers to Lexington Growth Fund and its affiliates, the very same investors we've just linked to political donations, zoning manipulation, and forced displacement strategies. She clicked the projector off. The room plunged into full light. The weight of what had just been shown and spoken left no room for interpretation. It wasn't just injustice. It was engineered, codified, monetized. The kind of injustice that wears a suit and carries a spreadsheet. She didn't need to raise her voice. You see, Mr. Johnson, she said, this isn't about urban revitalization. It's about rewriting the definition of value to mean only one thing, profit. Her voice dropped half a register. And it's about rewriting who counts and who gets counted. Then she stopped speaking. Not because she was finished, but because it was his turn. Across the room, Mike Johnson hadn't moved in nearly a minute. His eyes were no longer scanning the room, no longer darting between allies or searching for the right angle. They were down, fixed somewhere on the blank desk in front of him, as if he could will it to swallow him. The cameras, relentless and unblinking, zoomed in. Not on a man in command, not on a policymaker holding firm, but on a man who had no script left, no pivot, no shield, only silence. and a truth he could no longer outrun. The chamber was no longer just tense. It was suffocating, thick with the weight of everything that had just been revealed. The family paid pennies for a home, the internal memos, the financial links, the trembling voice of a man who had built the machine and then stood up to confess it. Jasmine stood with that silence still clinging to the corners of the room and then stepped forward again. Slower this time, heavier, as if every inch she crossed brought her closer to something irreversible. She didn't look at her notes. She didn't need to. Her voice came low, deliberate, but sharp enough to cut through every layer of denial left in the building. "Let's be honest now," she began, eyes locked on Johnson. "This isn't about data. This isn't about zoning. This isn't even about development. This is about who gets to exist in your version of the future." Her hand hovered over the thick binder of eviction records and settlement agreements, but she didn't reach for it. She didn't have to. "In the last 11 months alone," she continued, enunciating every syllable with surgical precision, "your urban rescue initiative forcibly removed 17,400 people from their homes." She let the number sink in, then repeated it, slower. 17,400 gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience seats behind her. Jasmine didn't flinch. "That's not growth. That's not progress. That's displacement on a scale most people in this room cannot imagine. And I want you, Mr. Johnson, to answer for that. I want you to tell the public right now, who did you design this for? Who did you decide gets to stay? And who, in your plan, is discarded like they were nothing but clutter?" Then her voice dropped, heavier still. "Tell me, sir, in your version of America, who is kept and who is called trash?" The last word didn't echo. It dropped like a stone. The entire room inhaled as one, but Mike Johnson's face flushed before anyone else could move. His spine stiffened. He leaned forward, the calm mask torn from his expression. Gone was the polished, patronizing smirk he had entered with. What replaced it was raw anger, undignified and exposed. Don't you dare!" he snapped, his voice sharp and defensive. "Don't you put that kind of language in my mouth. That's not what I said. That's not how I operate." His words came too fast, too loud, as though he was trying to shout down not Jasmine, but the truth that had already entered the room and taken its seat beside him. But Jasmine didn't blink. She stood still as granite, the fire in her gaze refusing to flicker. She stepped one pace closer, never raising her voice. "I didn't put it there," she said. "Your policy did." Her voice was almost quiet now, steady, cutting, undeniable. "When you approve a project that removes thousands of poor families and replaces them with luxury condos, when your spreadsheets calculate value based on projected investor returns, not human lives, when your team calls low-income areas zones of opportunity only after clearing them of the very people who gave those neighborhoods their soul, then no, you don't have to say the word trash." She paused, "because your decisions already did." The silence that followed was different now, no longer shocked, just damning. Even the Republican members of the committee who had smiled earlier now looked away, hands fidgeting with pens or paper cups, as if some part of them realized this wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was an unmasking. Mike Johnson sat frozen, mouth slightly open, as if reaching for a rebuttal that refused to come. The cameras focused in, first on his eyes, dodging hers, and then on the nameplate in front of him, now looking out of place beneath the weight of everything he could no longer deny. Jasmine leaned in, not to intimidate, but to finish what she had started. "We've heard a lot about what this initiative builds, but what we haven't heard," she said, her voice tightening like a final note in a symphony, "is who it destroys. You don't get to hide behind fancy brochures or PR buzzwords like revitalization. You don't get to call this compassion while wiping out entire communities with ink and signature stamps. You don't get to speak of lifting people up while your policies shove them out." She took a breath, not from fatigue, but from restraint. "So no, Congressman Johnson, I'm not twisting your words. I'm mirroring your impact. And if that reflection makes you uncomfortable, it's because it should." The air held that final sentence like a verdict. And for the first time all morning, Johnson didn't interrupt. He didn't lean back. He didn't smirk or scoff or signal to his aides. He just sat there, quiet beneath the crushing weight of every word he had just heard. And this time, the silence belonged to Jasmine. The silence that followed Jasmine's final sentence wasn't just stillness. It was weight, heavy, suffocating, the kind that settles on a room when something true has been said and no one can deny it. Mike Johnson remained motionless, jaw clenched, hands tight around the edge of the desk as if gripping it kept him from unraveling. But Jasmine wasn't done. Not yet. She didn't retreat. She didn't pause for applause or dramatics. She simply looked at the chairman and gave a quiet nod. "Permission to enter Exhibit 47B into the record," she said. The chairman, still visibly stunned, managed a nod. Jasmine turned back to her laptop. This time there was no map, no video, no victim crying on screen. Just audio. She clicked play, and the room filled with the faint hum of a conference call. The quality scratchy, but the voices unmistakably clear. "Let's be candid here," said a smooth male voice. Confident, comfortable, unhurried. "This is a historic opportunity to finally clean up these districts, reset the game board. We're not just building new space, we're clearing out the dead weight." A few heads lifted. The tension surged. "Look," the voice continued, "I know the optics are tricky, but frankly, these people don't bring market value. They don't attract investment. They bring problems. We need tenants who know how to spend, not people who just know how to complain." Jasmine didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The words from the recording did more than any argument ever could. They burned. The air in the chamber turned electric. Members shifted in their seats. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God." The tone of the man on the recording, casual, rich, untouched, was worse than if he had shouted slurs. He wasn't angry. He wasn't emotional. He was strategic, talking about human lives like they were obstacles on a profit sheet. The voice returned, even colder this time. "Once we get the fund through Phase 3, Lexington will recoup the investment within 18 months, especially once the holdouts are cleared. It's just math. The longer we delay, the more emotional it gets. And emotions don't belong in this conversation." At that line, Jasmine pressed pause. The room stopped breathing. She looked up, slowly, deliberately, and met Johnson's eyes across the chamber. And for the first time since the hearing began, he looked away first. The projector screen behind her froze on the audio waveform. It looked like a seismograph, like the room itself had registered an earthquake. In many ways, it had. Jasmine walked back toward the microphone. Her voice was quieter now, not because she was unsure, but because sometimes whispers are sharper than screams. That call was from a private meeting between representatives from Lexington Growth Fund and members of the Urban Development Council, she said. It was recorded by a whistleblower last fall. The voice you heard belonged to Robert F. Mears, lead strategist for the Lexington Municipal Investment Arm. She raised her eyes and delivered the next line not to the chairman, but to the cameras. "The fund that donated $2.1 million to Congressman Johnson's PAC last year." There was no laughter now, no smirks, not even whispers, just stunned stillness. She turned slightly, scanning the faces of the committee. "They said, and I quote, 'These people don't bring market value.' As if that justifies what's been done to them. As if being poor means you're disposable. As if families who've lived in the same house for generations deserve to be erased because they don't hold a platinum Amex." She faced Johnson again. "And you, sir, told this committee you were building opportunity, that you were rescuing communities." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "But behind closed doors, your partners were already calling them trash." The silence cracked. It wasn't a sound, but a shift. Like the atmosphere itself had turned against him. All eyes went to Johnson. He didn't speak, didn't blink. For the first time, he had nothing. Cameras zoomed in, not out of routine, but because this was a moment too human to miss. His face was pale now, jaw clenched, hands suddenly still. The trademark smirk, gone. The posturing, gone. What remained was a man cornered, not by political enemies, but by his own record. Jasmine stepped forward once more. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "You didn't have to say the word worthless, Congressman Johnson. Your policies said it for you. Your partners said it behind locked doors. And now the people know." She lifted the printed transcript of the recording and placed it on the desk in front of her. "Let the record show," she said, not to the chairman but to history itself, "that they didn't just displace people. They dehumanized them. And they did it with money, with contracts, and with the quiet approval of men who were elected to serve." She paused, holding her breath, then released it like a final shot across the bow. "We don't get to pretend anymore." Then, without waiting for a reply, Jasmine turned off the screen. The waveform vanished. The lights returned to full brightness. But the shadows in the room, they stayed. Mike Johnson sat as if he'd aged a decade in 10 minutes. He reached for his water but didn't drink it. His hands shook just enough for the cameras to catch. And the recorders, oh, they caught everything. The moment power cracked. The moment truth broke through. And above it all, Jasmine stood still, not victorious, but necessary. A witness, a prosecutor, and a voice for those no one else invited into the room. The hearing was still far from over. But in that moment, one thing was clear. The rescue wasn't urban, it was moral. And Jasmine Crockett had just pulled the city back from the edge. The room was no longer a courtroom. It had become a reckoning. The weight of what had just unfolded still hung in the air. Raw, unprocessed, like smoke from a fire not yet extinguished. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it all, but she did not move for applause. She did not lower her eyes. She stood completely still, shoulders squared, gaze fixed, not at the committee, not at Mike Johnson, but directly into the camera. There was no paper in her hands now, no binder, no screen behind her, nothing but the truth, standing upright in heels. She stepped forward once, then paused. Every heartbeat in the room waited on her next word. Her voice came low, steady, and stripped of every political flourish. It was not the voice of a congresswoman addressing colleagues. It was the voice of someone speaking to an entire nation and refusing to blink. "They always tell us poverty is a problem of the poor," she said slowly, as if choosing each word from a battlefield of options. "They say it's a matter of bad choices, of bad habits, of people who didn't try hard enough." Her voice did not rise, but it pressed harder with every word. "But that's not what we saw here today. That's not what the evidence showed. What we saw is that poverty is not a flaw. It is a consequence." She raised her chin just slightly. "Poor people are not the failure of the system," she said, eyes burning now. "They are the victims of people who call crime a development strategy." Gasps moved through the audience like a ripple across water. And then, a sound no one expected. A single clap, then another, then 5, then a dozen. A wave of hands rising in defiance of protocol. These hearings did not allow public applause, but this moment refused silence. The sound wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like hail on glass. Some clapped with tears in their eyes, others with clenched fists. Each clap a protest, each clap a sentence of its own. The chairman began to gavel for order, but even he faltered. He knew what this moment was, and he knew he couldn't stop it. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't look around. She didn't acknowledge the applause. She simply kept her eyes forward, piercing, unwavering, almost biblical in their steadiness. And then she said what no one else in the chamber had dared to say. "In cities across this country," she continued, "people are being priced out of existence, not because they failed, but because someone in a boardroom decided their existence was inconvenient to a quarterly return. And those people," she paused, voice narrowing to a whisper, "don't have PACs. They don't have lobbyists. All they have is the hope that someone will speak truth in the room where decisions are made." Another beat, another breath. She leaned in just slightly toward the microphone. "And that's what we did here today." Behind her, the screen was dark now, but the truth still echoed through every corner of the room. And then it happened. Mike Johnson stood up. No words, no rebuttal, no final retort to reclaim the floor. He simply gathered the folder in front of him, though it was clearly empty now in every sense, and stepped back from the table. The cameras followed him, uncertain. His steps were slow, measured, but his face was no longer composed. There was no smile, no smirk, no calculation left. He didn't nod. He didn't look back. He walked out as if somehow he knew that the story had already been written, and it would not carry his name as the hero. The doors clicked behind him like a gavel strike. And Jasmine? She remained standing. There was no celebration in her posture, no gloating, only the quiet fire of someone who had held the line when it mattered and refused to let the powerful rewrite what the powerless had lived. She looked back to the chairman now. "I yield," she said calmly. But everyone in that room knew she hadn't yielded anything. The people in the back, those whose names never made the news, whose homes had been bulldozed for someone else's skyline, sat motionless. One woman clutched her purse tighter, tears welling. An older man nodded slowly. Somewhere near the aisle, a teenager in a school hoodie stood and mouthed, "Thank you." Because Jasmine hadn't just confronted corruption, she had named it, stripped it, and lit it on fire. And though this was just one hearing, one morning, one building in Washington, D.C., its tremors would reach further than anyone in that room could measure. For some, it would be a headline. For others, it would be a warning. But for those who had nothing, it was the first time in a long time that someone had said aloud what they always knew, that they were never the mistake. The mistake was believing no one would ever fight for them. And on this day, someone finally did. The doors to the hearing chamber had long since shut behind Mike Johnson, but the impact of what had transpired lingered like smoke after fire. The gallery still sat frozen, not out of confusion, but because no one wanted to move too soon and break the spell. Jasmine Crockett had not merely survived a political ambush, she had turned it inside out. But the true moment of power wasn't when Johnson walked out in disgrace. It was now, in the silence that followed, when the real reckoning began. Jasmine remained seated for a long moment, her posture upright, her eyes fixed not on her peer, but on the audience behind her, on the housing advocates, the displaced families, the activists, the volunteers. They hadn't come for a spectacle. They had come for recognition, and she had given them that. But recognition wasn't enough. Not anymore. Now came the harder part, the part no camera could dramatize and no gavel could control. She stood slowly, then stepped forward again, not toward the committee, but toward the press pool, where the nation's eyes waited. She ignored the microphones. She ignored the flashing lights. And then, as if speaking to a room filled with ghosts, she began, "You all saw what happened today, but don't mistake this for a victory lap, because today was not a win. It was a warning." She paused, her voice steady but low. The room leaned in. We live in a system that confuses legality with morality, that wraps exploitation in legislation and calls it growth, that reduces human lives to development zones, tax brackets, and project phases. And today we saw the mask slip. Another pause. You heard them say it wasn't about race or class or power, but look where the bulldozers went. Look who got evicted at 3 a.m. Look who received $11,000 for a house worth $300,000. Look who was called market waste behind closed doors. The air grew tighter with each word. And the most dangerous part, she continued, her eyes scanning the room, it wasn't the deals, it wasn't the contracts, it was the silence. The silence of the people who knew, who saw, who benefited, and said nothing. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the machinery of injustice doesn't need cruelty to operate. It only needs comfort. It only needs enough people willing to look away. Her voice hardened. But we're not looking away anymore. From the far corner, someone whispered, "Amen." Jasmine turned slightly toward the camera lens now. And to every person watching this from a shelter, a motel, or the backseat of a car, hear me when I say this. You are not invisible, you are not disposable, and you are not alone. She drew a breath, her voice briefly catching, but she did not stop. You've been told you're a problem to be solved, a cost to be minimized, a footprint to be reduced. But the truth is, you are the soul of this country, The ones who raise children without safety nets, who work 2 jobs and still skip meals, who hold entire communities together while others cash dividends off your suffering. The room was silent now, not out of fear, but reverence. And to those in power who watched this hearing and felt embarrassed, threatened, or exposed, good. You should be. Because if you don't feel discomfort when injustice is laid bare, then you've lost the only compass that matters. She stepped closer to the center of the room. There is no urban rescue without the people who live in the city. There is no revitalization that starts with eviction. And there is no progress if it leaves behind the very people who built these communities, brick by brick, block by block. Jasmine then lowered her voice. This isn't about one man. This isn't about Mike Johnson. This is about a system that rewards dispossession and punishes compassion. A system where being poor is seen as a character flaw, and helping the poor is seen as political suicide. She let the silence fall again. Not to pause, to let the truth linger like a bruise. But here's the lesson we walk away with today, she said, her voice rising just a notch. That dignity is not a luxury, it is a right. That housing is not a favor, it is a foundation. That justice must be built from the bottom up, not handed down from penthouses. And then she smiled, the first real smile all day. Because they forgot something. They thought we would break. They thought we'd stay quiet. But we didn't. And we won't. Not tomorrow, not next year, not ever again. Applause tried to rise again, but Jasmine raised a hand gently. She wasn't finished. We have a long road ahead. Laws to change, agencies to audit, developers to hold accountable, but the most urgent task is harder than any of that. She looked back to the gallery. It's to teach this country how to feel again, to remind it what a home means, not just 4 walls, but safety, not just an address, but identity, not just ownership, but belonging. Now every camera lens locked on her. And that is the new measure of policy. Not how much GDP it creates, but how many children it protects, how many elders it shelters, how many lives it dignifies. The air was different now, no longer electric with confrontation, but charged with meaning. Jasmine could feel it, so she said the final words not with volume, but with gravity. We are not the ones who need saving. We are the ones who were never seen. And today, that changed. With that, she stepped back. The room remained still. Even reporters put their pens down. In the hallway, as Jasmine exited into the late afternoon sun, a teenage boy approached her. He wore a backpack too large for his frame, and his shoes were taped at the soles. He didn't ask for a selfie. He didn't ask for a quote. He just said, "My mom was scared, but after today, she's not anymore." Jasmine knelt slightly, looked him in the eyes. "Tell her she never had to be," she replied. The fear was never hers to carry. It belonged to the people who knew what they were doing was wrong and prayed no one would say it out loud. And with that, she walked forward, not away from the fight, but deeper into it, because that was the final lesson. You don't need to hold power to deliver justice. You just have to refuse to be silent 1 minute longer. The crowd began to thin from the Capitol steps, the tension finally bleeding into the afternoon light. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't left. Not yet. She stood just outside the hearing chamber doors, her silhouette cast long across the marble floor, speaking quietly with a few staffers and community leaders. The hearing was over. The evidence had been exposed. The man behind the curtain had been unmasked. But for her, this wasn't an ending. It was ignition. She turned toward the crowd that remained. Not reporters this time, but people, citizens, survivors, mothers with strollers, grandparents leaning on walkers, students with notebooks, janitors still in uniform, people who had been called invisible by the very system that claimed to rescue them. And as Jasmine stepped up to the impromptu podium, a makeshift mic rigged to a city worker's flatbed, the noise faded, again. Because they knew what was coming was more than a speech, it was a summons. Her voice didn't shake. "Today, you watched the curtain fall," she said, eyes sweeping across the crowd. "You saw how easily words like revitalization and rescue are used to disguise what is, in truth, erasure. You heard them talk about strategy when they meant eviction. You heard them call displacement an opportunity. She paused, the anger in her voice not uncontrolled, but earned. But let me tell you something. They made one mistake they'll never recover from. They let the cameras roll. They let the truth breathe. And now the lie can't be put back in the box. The crowd stirred. Jasmine didn't wait for applause. This isn't about what happened in that room. It's about what happens next. And if we walk away today feeling satisfied, if we call this a victory and move on, then we become complicit in the very silence that allowed this to fester. She took a breath, then raised her voice, not in volume, but in weight. So I'm asking you, no, I'm calling on you, not to cheer, not to repost a clip, but to act. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at her blazer. She didn't flinch. I want every displaced family to know this. We will not let your stories be buried beneath concrete and campaign checks. I want every investor who backed these deals to know you are not untouchable, and I want every policymaker still hiding behind paperwork to remember this is your wake-up call. The crowd began nodding. Phones rose, but Jasmine was only beginning. This is what we do now, she said, voice gaining momentum. We organize tenants. We challenge zoning boards. We rewrite ordinances. We file class actions. We build legal clinics in barbershops. We take protest chants and turn them into policy. She stepped down from the platform and walked into the crowd as she spoke. Not above them, but among them. We build city councils that don't need lobbyists to remind them who they serve. We audit every redevelopment deal that smells of backroom compromise. And we make it impossible for another so-called urban rescue initiative to be funded without public oversight, equity impact reviews, and local control. A woman in the front row shouted, "Where do we start?" Jasmine turned to her, pointing gently. "Right there. That question. That's the spark." She motioned to the back of the crowd where younger activists stood with clipboards. You sign up, you write letters, you show up at 6 a.m. when city council buries votes and hidden agendas. You get your neighbors to understand that gentrification isn't just a buzzword, it's a knife, slow and quiet. Now her voice hardened into something more forceful. They bank on your exhaustion. They bank on your disbelief. They think if they drag it out long enough, you'll forget, that you'll move, that you'll break, but you won't. A silence fell like a curtain drop. Because here's the truth they never planned for. Once people understand how power works, they don't just get angry, they get organized. The phrase echoed like a rallying cry. Someone repeated it, then another, then 20 voices at once. They get organized. Jasmine climbed back onto the platform. And don't let them tell you this is too complex, that you need a PhD to understand housing code, that only experts can talk about tax credits. Because you know who's an expert? The single mother evicted with 20 days' notice. The grandfather forced out of a rent-controlled home with nowhere to go. The child who lost her school when a luxury development replaced an entire block. She shook her head. Don't you ever let them convince you that your experience isn't data, that your pain isn't policy. The crowd surged forward, less like an audience now, more like an army forming. We hold teach-ins in laundromats. We speak truth in town halls built to suppress it. We show up to campaign events with receipts and timelines. We pull back the veil everywhere. She pointed toward the Capitol dome behind her. And we remind that building every day that democracy doesn't live in marble columns. It lives in resistance. It lives in voices raised together. It lives in the refusal to be forgotten. Now the applause came, thunderous, rolling, from young and old, from angry and hopeful. It wasn't celebration, it was commitment. Jasmine's final words came not as a plea, but as an invocation. We don't need to tear the system down. We need to stop letting it be built on our backs. We don't need another speech. We need another 1,000 people who refuse to be silent. Her voice dropped low. And when the next hearing comes, because it will, we won't just walk in with documents. We'll walk in with districts, with data, with people. And this time, they won't be able to look away. A teenage boy stepped up and handed her a handmade sign. Rescue the people, not the property. She held it high, and then she walked into the street, into the crowd, into the next battle. Because action wasn't a choice anymore. It was the only language power understood. The sun had dipped below the Capitol dome by the time Jasmine finally stepped away from the crowd. Her voice was raw, but her pulse steady. She had delivered her warning, not just to the architects of injustice, but to the nation. And the nation had heard her. But action, as she well knew, was never won on the Capitol steps alone. That evening, as night fell over Washington, the clip of Jasmine's speech surged across every platform like a current, with no dam strong enough to hold it. Not just the highlights of the hearing, but the moment she had stood among the people, declaring war on silence. It flooded group chats in housing coalitions. It played on loop inside community centers from Oakland to Baltimore. It wasn't just viral, it was galvanizing. She had struck something deeper than outrage. She had struck clarity. At 9:04 p.m., the Lexington Growth Fund released a curt, defensive statement claiming mischaracterization. By 9:22 p.m., an anonymous staffer from their finance division had posted 3 leaked memos online. One sentence exploded across the screen in bold type. Delay disbursement until Phase 2 gentrification zones are cleared of low-income resistance groups. Screenshots, red circles, arrows, names. By morning, the fire had jumped from the internet into newsrooms, and from there into legislation. In Austin, a city council vote on a zoning waiver for a revitalization corridor was abruptly postponed. In Philadelphia, a state senator withdrew her sponsorship of a land use bill tied to Johnson's allies. And in Tulsa, a local journalist ran a 2,000-word expose on a similar fund using nearly identical language about demographic reshaping. But Jasmine wasn't watching the coverage. She was already on the phone. By 7:45 a.m., she had spoken with 6 grassroots organizers across 3 states. At 9:13 a.m., she was already drafting a federal proposal, not symbolic but structural, a national transparency registry for urban development funds. By 11 a.m., she was in a closed-door meeting with legal experts, architects, and 2 economists, discussing how to model equity displacement scores into every future SHUD application. Because that was the thing about Jasmine Crockett. She didn't fight battles. She made them irrelevant. And yet, amid the strategy, the movement, the headlines, what remained clearest was a single image. A mother holding her daughter, standing just behind the temporary press barricade the night before. She hadn't said a word. She just stared. Her eyes were full, not of tears, but of memory, of what had been taken, of what might still be restored. Jasmine hadn't forgotten her. She wouldn't. Because this movement wasn't built on sound bites. It was built on faces. And the power that had once dismissed them as numbers now had to answer to names. Later that week, a new billboard appeared just outside Baton Rouge, Louisiana, along a stretch of highway once slated for eminent domain seizure. It read, "You can't rescue a city by erasing its people. Representative Jasmine Crockett." The campaign wasn't hers. A local union had paid for it, but it marked something more important than a quote. It marked a shift in story ownership. The narrative no longer belonged to the developers, or the lobbyists, or the elected who smiled while signing lives away in exchange for glass towers and golf course incentives. It belonged to the people now, and they were done waiting to be saved. They were coming for the blueprint. They were writing it themselves. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.